So let's make a start. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't even have to ask you to take your seat because everyone has already done so. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the European Policy Center, and the Odysseus Network. Before I take you through some of the key details about today's event, I would like to invite for the official welcome remarks Laszlo Andor, Secretary General of FEPS, and then closely afterwards Philip Goldberg, who's Deputy Director of the EU Brussels office of FES. Laszlo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And on behalf of FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, let me welcome you all. It's really great to see this room full of interest to listen to the panelists. But also to be able to start a little bit ahead of time. This is really not very common in Brussels, but also in the academia, where many of us are also involved. Let me also stress, secondly, something which also connects us with the academia, that FEPS as a think tank, we still believe in the power of the printed work. And indeed, we present to you and let's also say celebrate the studies that have been delivered on the topic which is in the focus of the interest today, implementing the so-called new Pact on asylum and migration, but also be patient and read also the subtitle, which is about solidarity, fundamental rights, and effectiveness at the same time in asylum and migration management in the European Union. And to use one of the most frequently used cliches of this city, to find the right balance or to strike the right balance between all these objectives is, of course, something which is very, very critical. Let's be honest, I should also say that when this new pact emerged, many of us had mixed feelings, to use another cliche, about the content and the balance that was created. And I think now, ideally, even if we had mixed feeling, let's see how the phase of the implementation can unfold and what we can learn out of the practice on this policy field where so many political debates took place. I should refrain from elaborating on the content. Let me just highlight that whatever FEPS does, it's almost always done in partnership. And we have had on this specific project an excellent partnership with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, but also the European Policy Center. And we work with the colleagues from FES, but also EPC on many other issues as well. And I hope that you find this presentation full of interesting substance, which should also feed into the subsequent discussions. What concerns FEPS, this is obviously not the only activity where we deal with migration and the question of asylum. FEPS has been running for years what we originally called a global migration group, and then more recently a progressive migration group that actually brings together experts from Europe but also Africa in equal numbers. And there have already been in the last 2 years very interesting exchanges between the experts brought together. FES was also involved, obviously, and I just want to highlight that you find on the FEPS website, but also in some of the printed publications, a lot of interesting output of that joint work as well. So now let's concentrate on the topic of the day. But indeed, before the panel, I hand over the microphone to Philip in order to deliver the second part of the welcome address.
Yeah, wonderful. Good afternoon also from my side. This is actually my first event in Brussels. I've just moved here after I was, for the last 5 years, working with our FES office in Dakar. So I looked at migration from a very different angle in the world, at least. And I'm very happy to open this event today here this afternoon. I would like to thank the Foundation for European Progressive Studies as well as the European Policy Center for collaborating with us in this project. And today this marks a very important milestone looking at the implementation of the new pact on base of these studies. So I will not go very deep into the topic now. First of all, we have a lot of experts here, and I came as many of you to listen to you, and I wish us a good discussion afterwards as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for the welcome remarks and, of course, for the very fruitful collaboration on this occasion, on the occasion of this project and also of previous projects. This event takes place, as we all know, in the middle of the EU transition, but also after a series of consequential political developments which have culminated in the US elections of last week. And these demonstrate, I think, quite clearly that migration management and the improvement of migration management remains and will remain a key electoral issue for the foreseeable future, other than a policy objective of many governments in Europe and beyond. But what does improving migration management actually mean and involve? If one was to trust the outgoing Commission, of course, the answer is the new Pact itself. And of course, after the adoption of the Pact reforms, many of us started feeling that perhaps this could open a new chapter in migration and asylum, where policies are designed and implemented using a common approach, using evidence-based plans to advance. The Commission and Member States, as you all know, accordingly started working on the development of implementation plans over the summer and then this fall, with the development of national implementation plans expected before the end of the year, and I'm sure we will be discussing those today. Yet many questions remain unanswered and also come to mind. For example, how will member states be able to square the discretion that they have been left with tighter obligations? What are the basic conditions needed for comprehensive implementation? What will take for solidarity and the solidarity mechanism to work for fundamental rights safeguards to be effective? And despite hopes for a new chapter, in recent weeks we also know that we have seen a re-emergence of divisive debates and mutual accusations between some member states, and also symbolic demands for opt-outs from the reforms. The beginning of the new EU policy cycle is also set to bring with it renewed attention to unfinished reforms, notably in relation to return. And some member states have already demanded further changes to the rules just adopted, particularly in cases of so-called instrumentalization, but also in relation to the notion of safe third country. And in this context, further questions arise. Can the EU remain focused and get implementation underway while also looking and negotiating further reforms? And how will these further reforms impact the functioning of the common European asylum system? I'm very happy to then move to our speakers, because surely they will be helping us today to unpack some of these questions and find answers together with some of those that have also been just laid out by Laszlo and Philip. And with us, we are lucky to have Lilian Zurdi, who's Associate Professor for Migration Law and Governance and Jean Monnet Chair at the Law Faculty of the University of Maastricht. We have Philippe de Broecker, who's a Professor at the Law Faculty and at the Center for European Studies at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and of course also founder and coordinator of the Odysseus network. We have Desislava Sitarska-Tomova, who's a policy officer in the asylum unit of DG Home of the European Commission. And last but not least, Katrin Woolard, who's director of the European Council on Refugees and Exile. Regrettably, Anna Catarina Mendes, who's a member of the European Parliament for the S&D group, will not be able to join us today, but on the bright side of things, that means that we will have more time for the panel exchange and also more time for the Q&A with our panelists. Now, a few words on the program of today's event. I will start by asking for some short input to our speakers, really briefly and to the point on key issues that will pave the way for the rest of the discussion. I want this to be a dynamic exchange, so we will follow up with some sort of speed debating between our speakers on key issues that we want to touch upon today before turning to you, to the audience. So please make sure to signal to me as soon as you have questions that you want to come in and ask to intervene, and I will start noting you down in my list. So I think this is everything, and I'm happy to make a start, and I would like to turn to Lilian first. And Lilian, of course, offered the first of the policy studies of the series, where she examined the reforms on screening, asylum border processing, and border return procedures. And these are meant to make a new seamless process at the EU's external borders. And in your piece, Lilian, you wrote, and I quote, "Creating a seamless border migration process is not inherently negative, as it reflects the intricate links between different policies and operational needs, especially in border areas and in light of mixed migration flows." And these are really the key things that oftentimes when people think about migration management have in mind, particularly in the context of external borders. But in your study, you also highlighted several challenges that could come with the implementation of these measures. So could you help us navigate a little bit these challenges? What are they? What do you see as key when looking at future implementation?
Yes, thank you, Alberto. And actually, you took my opening, as I also wanted to highlight that an important message is that the seamless border migration process is not inherently negative. However, it could raise a number of challenges as designed and as implemented. I will name several of them, but I will focus, in order to flesh it out, just one. And then there is also my study for more in-depth analysis. So some of the main challenges are curtailed procedural guarantees, inadequate material conditions, prioritizing efficiency over the quality of processing, and potentially excessive recourse to deprivation of liberty and restrictions to the freedom of movement. And to concretize this, I'm going to focus in one of the main challenges, which is curtailed procedural guarantees. So what do I mean by this? Which elements I'm referring to? First of all, there is a name for a very short processing time in this seamless border migration process, which is 12 weeks that can be extended to 16 weeks other than situations of crisis. So the risk is that in their effort to abide by these stringent time limits, member states might end up lowering the quality of processing. In addition, these restrictive time limits may not provide the necessary time for asylum seekers to prepare, to be appropriately informed, adequately prepare their file, and so this could lead to inadequate procedural outcomes. This actually challenge extends to the appeal phase. So the appeal period is brief. It's between 5 and 10 days. These are included in the time limits that I mentioned earlier for completing the border procedures, and they are also combined with a lack of an automatic suspensive effect of appeals, apart from the case of unaccompanied minors, which could raise the risk for potential cases of refoulement, so return to where asylum seekers have a real risk of facing torture, inhuman or degrading treatment.
Thank you, Lilian, also for keeping it very short. And you put your finger on many of the key issues that are also probably going to be touched upon later by Desi, but also the serious consequences that possible failures in implementation can have, particularly in connection to non-refoulement. So, of course, in our studies, we don't only look at the potential shortcomings, but we also thought of what could be way of implementing these rules in a protection-oriented manner. So could you maybe also lay out some of what you consider the key elements for ensuring adequate implementation in this sense?
Yes, so given these dangers or risks that could emanate from the legal design, this makes the implementation design and practical operationalization very important and key to ensure that actually the new rules will be implemented in a protection-oriented manner. So some crucial elements to look out there is first of all funding, so the appropriate financing of border processing. So at the EU level, the EU has indeed encouraged member states to take advantage of all existing EU funding to support them in building their capacity for this border processing. It has also managed to augment available amounts through the relatively recent mid-term review of the EU funding framework. And some further amounts will be made available through the solidarity components that are foreseen as part of the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation. Perhaps we will come back through that in the intervention of Philippe. So another element is appropriate services and expertise that needs to be available at locations where border processing is taking place. So very practically, this includes legal information and advice, translation and interpretation expertise, and cultural mediation. And finally, medical and psychological support. Often, asylum seekers suffer from medical conditions or have endured trauma due to the reasons of flight or trauma sustained during the transit process. So receiving appropriate follow-up is a prerequisite for them to be able to meaningfully pursue their case. And this is also linked with identification of vulnerability and making accessible the necessary follow-up and services, which is something that is also foreseen on paper, on Pact instruments, but it needs to be realized in practice.
Thank you, Lilian. You were really on the mark, so I'm happy to immediately turn to Philip, because, of course, the studies are interconnected, and of course, the widely shared view among many commentators is that because of these new rules, particularly in the case of member states at the EU's external borders, there is a need for some sort of a balancing mechanism that goes beyond the rhetoric, which is frequently utilized indeed in Brussels, particularly because there were minimal changes to responsibility allocation rules. And I want to quote also your study, and this is a way also to invite our audience to pick some of the studies that are available at the entrance. And in your study, you wrote that the fundamental political choice to keep Dublin instead of amending it in favor of a fairer system requires a very strong mechanism of solidarity. And a mechanism of solidarity is indeed in the new pact. As we all know, member states will have to contribute either by relocations, financial contributions, or in-kind contributions. So, Philippe, is this not a huge achievement for the EU? And I think you've been around, so you've seen these discussions evolving over time, but also more critically, is this mechanism and the broader management system strong enough to answer the question that you yourself pose in the study?
Well, it's very difficult to answer that question, to use another cliche, but I will try to provide you some elements of reflections. And I would say that actually it depends if it will be enough or not. As you probably know, a minimum of solidarity is foreseen. It is 20,000 relocations of asylum seekers between member states and at least 600 millions of euros for financial solidarity. But what is less known, and it's important to notice it, is that actually this minimum binds only the European Commission when it will draft its proposal. So that actually during the decision-making process that will involve the high-level forum on solidarity and ultimately the Council, it is not impossible to go beyond those figures. You can go above, but you could also imagine to go below. So we don't know if these figures that are foreseen will be enough, but we certainly do not know if they will be increased or decreased by the forum and the council. So let me just say one more word about the forum, which is actually a very strange body, a kind of quite curious new invention that actually is not governed by a clear decision-making rule. Nobody knows how the forum will function. Will it be based on consensus or unanimity, or will they organize a kind of qualified majority vote? This is not foreseen in the forum. It's very important to keep in mind that the forum actually will play a key role because it binds the council. The council will be obliged, if it disagrees with the forum, to send back the file to the forum for a new meeting. Of course, one can say that this is not likely to happen because actually the members of the forum will be appointed by member states, and they will be, to say so, normally mini-ministers compared to the ministers sitting in the council. But you never know what can happen. So to summarize, on paper, it is not sure that the necessary level of solidarity is guaranteed. We don't know. Let's hope that in practice, actually, we will have a strong implementation and that we will then meet the objective. So let's wait and see, keeping in mind that actually, of course, the level of solidarity will depend upon the level of responsibility that will be produced by the new Dublin regulation. If the new Dublin functions quite well so that southern member states take over their responsibilities, you may have then an adequate level of solidarity. But let's imagine that the new Dublin would not function well and that there are still a lot of secondary movements, then you could see a very low level of solidarity through this new mechanism.
Thank you, Philip. And I think you're pointing to many uncertainties. And of course, we have the Commission today who can perhaps provide us, enlighten us with some insights as to where you see things going. But to put things a bit in context, I think that Philip's interventions also hint at the potential political consequences that come from lack of effective implementation. And unlike what many hoped after the adoption of the reforms, we have recently seen a re-emergence of divisions between member states. Some member states also pushed quite heavily against what they called as almost an interference by the European Union in what they consider domestic affairs, pushing back against some of the reforms, already saying that they will not comply or they will not participate in relocation efforts. On the other hand, both the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the European Council at the most recent summit in October stressed the importance of implementing the adoption or the adopted legislation. So the question is, are all countries, including those who have been resisting the most, on course, on time, and will they deliver their national implementation plans?
Thank you very much, Alberto, and good afternoon to everyone. Happy to be part of this discussion. So it's very good that we have now the agreement and that we can have the discussion on the implementation actually, because the discussion is not anymore about what, it is about how. And this is exactly what we in the European Commission are trying to do currently. Because the recently adopted legislation, it defines the reform the way the co-legislators wanted to have it. Now it's the time to put our perspective on how to operationalize this. There is no need anymore to discuss whether this was a good solution or a bad solution, or there was potentially a better solution or a better option. Now we have something very concrete. It was a historical agreement after all the years that we spent, and from our perspective, this is a very good opportunity, an opportunity to actually bring the common European asylum system to a new level. And that is why the implementation is so important, because now we have a huge reform, a reform that was discussed so many years. Now it's part of the legislation, but it's not that easy to implement it. It's not that you wake up one day and everything is put in place. A lot of things needs to be changed, starting from the legislation, going through the practice, through the administrative procedures. There are many elements that needs to be brought forward. And it's not only one element. It's not to choose, I will upgrade my responsibility system or my border procedures. It's the combination of all the elements. That's why it is a new pact, because only in combination the new legislation can deliver to the results we all expect. That's why, as of the first day of adoption, the Commission actually turned to the implementation. And it's all about planning, 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 because there are many things to be changed in parallel. And that is why there will be always question whether this might turn to the opposite, whether it will not be sufficient. But it's our role to ensure that it will be sufficient, that there will be the solidarity will be equal to the responsibility, that all the procedural guarantees enshrined in the new legislation will be implemented by the member states. Because when we talk about curtailing the procedures and the procedural rights, or shortening the time-wise, at the end of the day, in the same regulations, we have more procedural guarantees, more information to be provided, stronger role for the Commission, stronger operational support to be given to the member states by the agencies. So I would say we have all elements in order to succeed. It is now how we implement them in the practice, how we make them complement each other, interact with each other, in order to see how far we can go with the implementation. From the Commission side, we launched the Common Implementation Plan. We are in constant dialogue with all the member states, because now by mid-2026, they all need to reach the moment of implementation, but they have different starting points for different elements. So through the national implementation plans, we are trying to support them in their efforts. And by trying to accelerate certain elements, we are trying to see what can work in the practice to the extent possible under the current legislation. What I mean here, if I may explain a little bit, it's we have the objective in the regulation, but you can reach this objective by A, B, C, or D. Sometimes you can choose the instrument through which you can reach the objective. So in the implementation phase is also to see how a decision-making procedure will work, what kind of interaction of the measures you need to organize in your national plans, what kind of systems and standard operational procedures you would need, what kind of administrative arrangements you would need. Because some of the things, it's how you translate the legislation into your national practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Desi. Don't put the microphone down yet. I'm sure Catherine wouldn't mind if I ask quickly a follow-up question, and I will ask you to keep it brief. In the letter I just mentioned by von der Leyen to member states ahead of the October Council, the President of the Commission also stressed the importance of accelerating the implementation of the Pact reforms, and so did the appointed Commissioner Magnus Brunner in his hearing. Is early implementation a realistic prospect, also considering what you just mentioned in terms of the interlinkages and interdependence of the different files? Would this early implementation concern all the files, all the new frameworks?
It depends. It's difficult to give a yes or no answer. I'll try to keep it short, but there are certain elements of the reform that there is no need to wait for 2 years. There are certain elements for a very good reason. The legislation envisages 2 years for implementation because there is need of significant change in the legislation and in the practice. And there are other, I'll give an example, my favorite topic of Dublin. The Dublin system can be performed in a more efficient way under the current regulation. We have the Dublin roadmap by the Commission side focusing on the Dublin transfers. These are things that there is no need to wait for 2 years in order to start implementing and to improving the current implementation, because the better level we bring the current implementation of the current legislation, this is a better start for the new pact to be put into application. So we see all this as different opportunities for different strands of the pact to be accelerated in their implementation.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Desi, also for keeping it to the point. And I'm happy to move to Catherine. And Catherine, in a recent op-ed, which we all read, I'm sure also those in the audience, you wrote that a comprehensive implementation of the law to get asylum systems working and sensible preparations for potential major displacement crisis are of the essence in this moment. And these are, I think, many aspects that many of us are considering and wondering about as key. Now, regarding the former, also in connection with what Desi was just talking about in terms of implementation, do you see still a risk in terms of selective implementation, particularly if then there was an effort to go ahead and implement rules ahead of time? More broadly, because again, the aspect that Desi also touched upon about the interlinkages between the different elements of the Pact. What is the importance of a comprehensive, evidence-based and human rights compliance approach to implementation in your view?
So thank you very much. We would say there's quite a high risk of selective implementation, and this is in a sense the natural behaviour of states. They want to implement elements that they prefer rather than other elements and try to avoid compliance with parts of a legal framework that they don't want. I think the current debate on front-loading and indeed on acceleration illustrates this. This is an attempt to prioritise certain parts of the Pact over other parts, and there are states who from the beginning have been trying to focus, for instance, on border procedure and for this to have more weight. So in that context, the importance of the comprehensive approach is manifold. First, it's about keeping the balance, as rightly explained, between responsibility in the sense of procedural changes and solidarity. If certain elements start to go ahead or are prioritised or are funded more than other elements, the whole deal can unravel. It's based on very delicate compromise. secondly, the question of procedural guarantees. Being comprehensive is also about respecting the procedural guarantees that have been integrated throughout the legislative framework. And this was of particular importance to the European Parliament as co-legislator. And the only reason that Parliament agreed to many of these files was because of the introduction of safeguards. It's also the only way that applicants can have any vestige of a fair procedure is if the procedural guarantees are respected. So comprehensive in that sense is also extremely important. Finally, I think there's the question of implementation in a way that respects EU primary law, and not least the Charter of Fundamental Rights, international law, and the jurisprudence of the courts. Out of necessity, the texts are full of uncertainty and ambiguity because this was the only way to get an agreement. So there's a lot there that needs to be interpreted, and that should be done in line with primary law and with the existing jurisprudence of the courts. I think in this context, the next commissioner, when he comes in, and we assume he's coming because he did kind of sail through the hearing last week, he needs to very quickly take a strong line on this and keep states focused on implementation. I think what we're seeing is that in this hiatus, with the outgoing commission relatively passive, states are jumping in and trying to shift implementation in a way that suits them, or some of them are aiming actually to avoid implementation altogether. And I think the worst possible thing that could happen is that the legal framework reopens, because then we've just had 8 years of this, and that is a way for certain states that don't want a common European asylum system at all to avoid implementing what's been agreed.
Thank you. And I'm sure that we will go back to the prospect of the discussion restarting on a new set of potential reforms and what would be the basis for that. We can certainly touch upon that later. I also wanted to pick your brain on the second element of your op-ed that concerns preparedness. As we know, there is instability, growing instability throughout the world. And I think in your op-ed, you also point at the prospect of potential large-scale displacement. And I wonder, what is your take on the newly adopted instrument that should enable greater preparedness for these kind of situations? Do you think that the crisis and force majeure regulation provide sufficient tools to deal with such prospect? And then I think if you stick to the time, I might actually take advantage and ask a follow-up question.
Ooh, what an incentive. In terms of being prepared, for us, the principle of preparedness is having a functioning asylum system. That's how you prepare for a crisis. And that means identifying and addressing implementation gaps. The Commission has done that as part of the preparation of the national implementation plans. We've done that over many years with the AIDA database that we manage, where we've identified what are existing implementation gaps that should be filled. And then it's putting in the resources necessary in terms of financial and human resources to have a well-functioning asylum system and to comply with the law. And that sets states up for a situation where they can respond should there be an increase in arrivals. I think before the crisis regulation should be invoked, there are at least 2 other steps that should be in place. One is having the functioning system. The second level is having the strong contingency plan, which is provided for under the RCD. After that, there's the use of exemptions in situations of large-scale arrivals where deadlines can be extended, for instance, within the context of the standard APR RAM regime, and only after that, and when duly justified, should one of the 3 special derogatory regimes provided for by the crisis regulation be activated. So I think one form of selective implementation that we might see is that states try to jump immediately to one of the three special regimes. And it should be underlined that there are a number of rules and steps that have to be taken. If they haven't got in place a well-prepared system, they legally should not be allowed to invoke a crisis regime. As a final note on that, I think, unfortunately, this whole debate about crisis preparedness often becomes an effort to try to prevent people arriving in Europe. And if we look at the development of early warning centres in third countries, that is where that's going. And that is something, when other countries are already doing significant amount, that should be avoided. The second, that's my final point, in relation to this is also, I would say, continued strong management of the displacement from Ukraine. And their preparedness is about preparing for the likely partial ceasefire agreement that is coming towards the end of next year, and having a collective way to manage the 5 million people displaced who are hosted within the EU. This, to me, seems like a quick win for the new commissioner to re-engage on Ukraine displacement and return to what we saw in the first 10 months after the invasion, which was strong leadership from the Commission, which has unfortunately rather faded away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And there will be time later for my follow-up question. I'm happy to move to Desi, as I can see that you wanted to come in. But also I wanted to ask you, as of course, this is also an opportunity to inform our audience about the next steps. And of course, member states will also have to prepare the national strategies and also think of contingency planning. So maybe you can also lay out what the steps are in that respect, other than replying to some of the remarks by Catherine.
Yes, I just want to use the opportunity to clarify certain things, because indeed we are all talking about the balance and keeping this balance. What is, however, important, because if you put on one scale 0 on the one side and 0 on the other side, you still have a perfect balance, but it's not an effective one, it's not a working one. So what we are trying to reach through the pact, it's not just the mere balance, it's more to go for a very effective and resilient balance through the responsibility and solidarity part, through efficiency, speed, quality, to have it everywhere, this balance that we need in order to bring the asylum system at a new level. Then some things, indeed, they're not finalized by their understanding, because apart from interpreting what is in the legislation, we need to bear in mind that we have around 17 implementing acts to be developed, because AMMR per se gives the Commission the implementing powers on 15 different strands, to detail and to give procedural rules how exactly certain things will happen. We have a good number of templates to be drafted, guidelines by the agencies. All this is in the pipeline currently and will be shortly delivered. So when it comes to your question, the next steps on the contingency plan, as Catherine said, RCD is envisaging this new obligation for all member states to develop a contingency plan. And it sets certain elements that this contingency plan should have. The deadline, EOEA developed a template, because this was a requirement set in the RCD, and the member states shall develop their national contingency plans by April 2025, if I'm not wrong, but the deadline itself is set in the Reception Conditions Directive. The same goes also for their national strategies, because again, a new novelty that AMMR brings is the need to have all member states to have their national strategies that cover not only asylum or only borders on only migration, but to have the whole process, the so-called comprehensive approach, how they manage the whole system, because gaps in one part of the system may impact the other part of the processes. These national strategies, they also need to follow a certain template, so it's not whatever I want to put there. All the necessary, the minimum elements will be set by a template to be introduced by the European Commission according to AMMR. and then the national strategies shall be ready in the summer of 2025, and they will be used as a basis of the European strategy, which AMMR envisages a deadline to be presented by the Commission December 2025. So as you can see, there are a lot of elements that we are still building in the road towards the effective implementation. We still have cards to be played, if I may use this rhetoric, in the road of implementation, because all these are pillars that will facilitate the implementation, that will give guidelines and help member states how to orient their national policies in order to have this effective implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Desi. And I'm going to now move back to Lilian and Philip. Philip, allow me to turn to Lilian first. As something which is, of course, of key importance when it comes to implementation and has not been brought up yet is money, of course. And I would invite you to take a look at the very interesting blog post regarding financial support for implementing the rules that Lilian has recently published. And I was wondering whether you could give us a sense of how you see potential needed changes in terms of the funding for implementing the rules, but also in connection to something that you wrote in your blog post, which is typically the EU funding made available has been emergency driven rather than the kind of structural funding that will be needed for a balanced and comprehensive and effective implementation. So maybe you can elaborate on some of these key concepts before we turn to Philip. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So one important caveat and any starting point on discussions on funding is that funding for migration is also constrained by the multi-annual financial framework. So we have a 7-year framework. The current one is running from 2021 to 2027. It already foresaw a specific file for the area of freedom, security and justice, and in what concerns migration, asylum and external border control. There is some leeway there between the exceptional margins, etc., but largely things are set in this 7-year period. So that is why also the Pact instruments, they could not completely innovate, for example, in and of themselves and say, we are passing to a compensatory logic here for whatever you do in border processing, come and get it from the EU level. This would have not been possible to begin with because we are constrained by a philosophy of how the budget has been constructed, and that can only reopen for anything more revolutionary, evolutionary as of 2028. So already the Pact instruments are working in this environment. Within there has been a small opening because in the solidarity mechanism that Philippe also mentioned, the funding that will come there is kind of new money on the table. So it is member states bringing money from the national budgets to the EU budgets as externally assigned revenue. So we do have an injection, if you will, of fresh money. But as we heard, this is probably going to look rather limited in the big scheme of things, at least to begin with. So again, it could be, though, an interesting experiment that as the forum starts becoming operational, it is something that could become more ambitious. But again, the solidarity, coming to your second point on emergency driven and how much we connect, let's say, these investments as being structural or as being exceptional, already the need for solidarity is connected with pressure. So there are, of course, more than in the past, objective indicators to see who and when, etc. But still, it is not yet foreseen as a structural element within the system. Already, you need to be a country in need of solidarity.
Thank you, Lilian. And you offered the perfect segue for my question to Philip. As I wanted to go back to this question of indicators, and as also mentioned before, there are a number of steps that will have to be taken in the months to come. There are processes in place. There are steps that national authorities need to set in place using then parameters and indicators, for instance, in relation to an assessment of what countries can be considered under pressure and therefore benefit from solidarity. And I was wondering, because you also talked about the management cycle in your study, and this is something that you've often reflected on. Do you think that the new cycle and then having these parameters and indicators in place will mean that we will finally have a depoliticized discussion on the implementation of migration and asylum policy? Or do you see still a strong risk in terms of the potential re-eruption of all debates with member states ignoring the newly adopted rules and then simply trying to take a unilateral approach disregarding indicators and pushing for their own national interest in these matters?
Well, I already mentioned in my first answer to your question that there is a risk regarding the balance to establish between solidarity and responsibility, that if the new responsibility mechanism, the new Dublin rules, do not function well, you will then probably have, as a consequence, less solidarity provided by the member states. So a lot will depend upon the way the Dublin regulation, the new Dublin rules will be implemented, and in particular if secondary movements between member states will decrease. So that's a starting point, and in that sense it's not a depoliticized process. I am afraid that on the contrary, you may have very strong political reactions to bad implementation of the new Dublin rules. And let's keep in mind, for the moment, to take an example, that Italy doesn't accept to receive any Dublin transferee from Germany. That's the position of Italy for the moment. So is this going to change the day the Pact will be implemented or not? If not, then of course this will create a problem. Now, regarding the policy cycle, I think that there are two elements that should be mentioned. The monitoring of the process, and there we have actually a very vague provision in the AMMR, which is Article 7, extremely general and vague, but luckily it is possible, it will be possible to, for the migration management cycle, to rely upon the monitoring done by the European Union Asylum Agency. And there you have a strong mechanism. So you have to look to, in a comprehensive way, to the AMMR and other regulations like the European Union Asylum Agency. But now, of course, one question is, the EUAA has the means to do a strong evaluation, but will it be politically able to do so? Because let's not forget that the management board of an agency is made of representatives of member states. And in a certain sense, we hope here that an agency made of representatives of member states will really monitor member states. And this this may become a kind of contradiction. Just to finish, I think that there is a real weakness what regards sanctions, in particular if member states do not provide enough solidarity. Nothing is foreseen. This idea that member states would have to pay 20,000 euros for the persons that they refuse to relocate has strangely disappeared. It was floating in the air during the discussion, and it's not in the latest version. So actually, we will have to rely upon infringement procedure, to the point that it will be possible, of course, in such a political process, to find really binding elements to start an infringement procedure. Knowing that, what we can say on the basis of experience is that the infringement procedure is not a success and is rarely used by the Commission. Just to finish there, that with a regret, actually, when you think about another policy cycle, which is the Schengen policy cycle, weak in terms of legal foundation, because there is no legal basis, but strong in terms of functioning, because in the Schengen policy cycle, the idea is that it is possible to force member states to apply plans to change and to put the things in the right direction. This is not foreseen under the IMMR, and that's probably a weakness.
Thank you, Philip. We will now move to the last round of comments from our speakers, and after these we will have our Q&A, for which we have half an hour. So as I proceed to ask some more follow-up questions to our speakers, don't hesitate to already signal to me that you would like to raise a question, so that we can quickly transition to the Q&A. Before that, there are a couple of important things that have just been mentioned, and I want to go back to. Maybe I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you about infringements, but there is a different dimension to these, which is leverages. What leverages can the Commission use in order to persuade member states to comply with their obligations, with all of their obligations under the new system? And then I will turn to the other speakers on the question on enforcement and sanctions. And if you still want to come in, then of course you'll be welcome to.
Thank you very much. I would rather prefer to have this discussion that we put some positive thinking, some optimism in how it will function, because it's not that for every obligation we have in the European legislation, we have a sanction directly in the same regulation. It's more interlinkages of measures that every obligation introduced by the union legislation shall be implemented. This is the usual way, the presumption that we usually introduce. So first, if they don't comply with their obligations, it is a shell provision. Giving a solidarity is a mandatory. There is a fair share for every single member state. How exactly, what kind of measure they will choose, this is for them to choose. This is a possibility for them to choose, but they are obliged by the regulation to provide solidarity. So this is part of this Council implementing decision, part of the discussion of the high-level forum. Actually, all these institutions, different bodies, they are introduced by the legislation exactly to mitigate a possibility where the solidarity is not sufficient or where more discussions are necessary. But text is clear. It is a legal obligation to participate in the solidarity mechanism. It's not a question of choice. Of course, in case of systematic infringements, launching an infringement procedure is always an option for the Commission under the treaties. This is not also for AMMR, only for AMMR. This is for all legislations. And then we have something similar in the asylum field compared to the Schengen evaluation cycle and the recommendations. We have the possibility, in case the recommendations of the monitoring of the EUAA are not respected, to launch a direct action in the member state. This is a possibility under the EUAA regulation. If some member state systematically refuses to introduce and to comply with the recommendations given by the agency following a monitoring mechanism, to start a direct action in this member state. Of course, we can have this discussion about whether we can have a more independent monitoring or what will be, but what's important is that we keep it operational, we keep it effective, and it delivers results. And we have all the instruments in the legislation. It is up to us. By us, I mean the Commission, the civil society, the member states, all institutions, to organize these processes in a way that they will be put in place. But everything is in the legislation. It's there. It's not necessarily always in the MMR. We need to read all of them, but these things are there. Thank you.
Thank you, Desi. I'm going to come to you in a second, Catherine, if you don't mind, but maybe briefly first on monitoring, as this is an aspect that you have also written about extensively, including in your study. And of course, in your study, you do emphasize the potential added value of the monitoring mechanisms, but you also think of the challenges, not as criticism per se, but to think ahead of what would be needed in order to make these mechanisms effective. So would you like to also come in this discussion and lay out in your view both what the challenges are and also what you consider of the essence so as to avoid evidently the problems that we have been discussing in the first place. Over to you, Lilian.
So there has been a broader actually emergence of softer mechanisms. So I have a new research project looking into soft enforcement in the EU migration field. But what we see is this proliferation of alternative mechanisms. One of the mechanisms are monitoring mechanisms, and it is not just one. So the Pact actually has national level monitoring mechanisms that are being introduced that are meant specifically to monitor the screening and the border processing, but they come in a constellation actually of other monitoring procedures that have emerged. So several speakers also referred to the ones that are connected with EU agencies. So we have the vulnerability assessment through Frontex, and we have also now a monitoring mechanism under the Agency on Asylum. We have, as part of the Schengen governance, also the Schengen evaluation and monitoring mechanism. So there is an increasing, if you want, universe of monitoring mechanisms trying also to address these enforcement gaps through different means. In their ultimate steps, they could be connected with a harder enforcement, and this is what Desi was pointing at. So they could lead to a council implementing act that actually mandates deployments in the territory of member states. In the case of Schengen, it could be the exceptional reintroduction of border controls with a specific member state. But as a baseline, it is that we do not reach this ultimate level, but that actually there is this dialogue, constant dialogue, monitoring, recommendations, and changes that need to be happening on the ground. What I would say about their effectiveness is that they are definitely a very important piece of the puzzle, but they cannot be, they have to come in complement also with other mechanisms. They are not of enforcement, I mean, not of monitoring. They cannot give single-handedly, they're not a panacea, and they cannot give single-handedly a solution to the enforcement problems. But they do have an important role to play, as they can have more incisive and flexible type of recommendations than an infringement proceeding that is going to be, okay, there is a violation, there is no violation, and here is a fine. So it's more restricted in its output.
Thank you, Lilian. And now turning to Catherine before we open the Q&A, also maybe to hear your thoughts on this issue. And I probably, like you, couldn't but notice, of course, that the Commissioner has also discussed in his hearing questions around sanctions and questions around enforcement. So it would be important to hear your viewpoint on this matter as well.
Yes, so I think this is a political decision of the Commission. Will the Commission come in and decide to enforce the law? And over the last years, in our view, there has been a certain neglect of the question of compliance because all the effort and energy and resources were being put into the reform issue. So it is that we hope will change now that the reform has ended. Where is the power of the Commission in this? It's partly in the measures that have been described, in soft law, pressure, going to infringement procedures, which I think do have an impact when they're actually used. But there's also the question of political deals linking to other areas of EU policy and EU law and EU funding. So if we have, there's so much underlying this. I asked the question, for instance, why did Italy ever accept this agreement? I think this is to do with benefits in other areas of EU policy and law, not to do with the asylum and migration area. Why would a state accept something that's patently not in its own interest? Well, at the same time, when the French presidency convinced Italy to go ahead and be on board with this, there was a lot of discussion about post-COVID funding, of which Italy is the prime beneficiary. So I think there are ways to find leverage, and then we will also all continue to rely on the courts. And most member states, with a couple of notable exceptions, do still want to follow the law. We know that also partly because of all these efforts to change what is in the law in order to legalise bad practice, but that is because they are hesitant to flagrantly violate the law. So on the final point there, if we look at this question of instrumentalisation, for instance, not only is there an effort to open up the EU's legal framework, there's a strong effort to influence Strasbourg jurisprudence with the 3 decisions the Grand Chamber will pass, judgments coming at the end of February, which is also an effort to try and change international law. And while that can be resisted, I think it does show that the judgments passed by the court do have weight, even though sometimes it seems that may not is not always the case. From ECRE's perspective, we've ended up in the rather paradoxical position that was referred to in the opening remarks of other organisations as well, that we didn't want this pact and we don't particularly like it, but now we're strongly arguing for implementation, because if the legal framework opens up again, it will for sure be worse. So the comprehensive implementation in line with fundamental rights and other aspects of primary law does seem to be the preferable approach.
Thank you, Catherine. In the interest of time, I'm happy to now move to the Q&A with the audience. I already saw a couple of hands, but if others would like to come in, I would be happy to also take the first 3 questions. Then please introduce yourselves and keep your question to the point so that we can have a second round, and don't hesitate to also mention who the question is for. So the gentleman here with the red shirt, and the microphone is coming.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Gabriele Sospiro, and I'm the director of the Brussels-based think tank whose name is ESEPA. And actually, I've just got back recently from Ethiopia, and there the flavor is very different when you talk about migration down there. Very, very differently. I cross-read, the policy brief, and there are, a few questions, actually some inputs. And the first one is to me is 7 days screening and 12-week borders processing time. It's rather optimistic, I would say. Probably it's rather optimistic, especially when you think about complex cases involving vulnerabilities. So probably we should, a little bit reformulating also that idea. Second point, there are, into the working into the policy brief, according to me, wouldn't be better to have a more precise definition of safe country. A lot of things are running across, the topics of safe country, but I think in the briefs, it seems to me that it's missing a little bit of more precise definition of safe country. And the other very quickly point is that relocation against funding. I totally agree with Professor De Brucker. It's either it's binding or nothing. Which bring me to the last point, which is connected with, it seems to me that a lot of the new pact is also insisting on the cooperation with third countries. Yesterday I was talking a lot with some friends of mine who are from Tunisia, and I think the cooperation with Tunisia is something that we really need, to look with carefully, very carefully. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for these 4 questions. So, not to take the bad habits of the European Parliament when asking questions to the Commissioner, please stick to 1 question and then we can have a second round if there is time. Then we have also a question back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Axel Bartel. I'm working on migration here for the representation of Brandenburg, the region of Brandenburg, a German region. And recently in October, there was the meeting of the European Council, and there the member states, they backed more or less the Polish decision or the decision of the Polish government to not accept any asylum seekers at their border with Belarus because they see it as a kind of hybrid warfare. So I would like to know from you if this measure is covered by this migration pact. Could you do this? And if this is so, what would be new other hybrid threats or borders where you could establish this this point?
Thank you. And then the last question over here.
Hello, I'm Ilenia for the Policy Department at the European Parliament. I was just curious, given the challenges observed with the Italian-Albanian model thus far, do you believe this may also impact the implementation for the new pact, and if yes, how they will impact them?
So quite a few questions for us to address, and I think that as long as I don't see further hands raised, I'm not going to put you under pressure to keep your answers too short. I think I'm going to contradict you on that. I think all of these questions could easily go to you as well. But maybe I'm going to start by the first question that was asked on the 7 days screening. Is this too optimistic? And then since Lilian, I'm going to ask you to take this question. Maybe you can already share your thoughts on the questions around the definition of safe third country. And I'm going to go back to you on this one as well. Yeah.
So certainly it is an ambitious timeline, not only the 7 days of the screening, but also the processing in 12 weeks, unless it is a case of relocation, where then it raises into 16 weeks. And it is something optimistic considering current practice at the borders, where there were border processing, not according to the new pact, but national variants happening if one thinks of Greece. So if we think of the timing, let's say, that it took to process applications. Of course, the ambition is that this is going to be now more effective and efficient, and that there will be more resources, as Desi mentioned, drawing on funding, cooperational support, etc., etc. But still, and that is what I mentioned in the report, the risk is that in order then to be efficient and to attain this swift deadline, that what will be the outcome is watering down in the quality of processing. It is a real risk. It hasn't, we don't know if it will materialize, but we can see why this could be the case. In terms of the safe third country definition within the text, and speaking of reopening the legislation, this is a part where actually through the law itself there was a window of reviewing the specific provision in 1 year's time. This had to do also with negotiating compromises. And of course, there is the policy spectrum that this provision will reopen, in fact, in order to somewhat water down guarantees in what concerns specifically a connection requirement with a specific third country, and that, of course, in view of augmenting, let's say, these kind of practices and returns in countries that can be considered safe.
Thank you, Lilian. And I'm happy to quickly move to Katrin, as I think you probably have some strong thoughts to share on this issue. If you could limit yourself to this, and then I'll ask you follow-up questions.
I was going to come in on the Brandenburg question.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
So in terms of the question of hybrid threat and instrumentalization, I think we should understand this whole debate as a concerted effort to end the right to asylum. And the instrumentalization of people, the idea of weaponizing or manipulating refugees is not something new. This has happened throughout the whole of history. States have instrumentalized refugees since states were created, and before that, empires and kingdoms did the same thing. So this is an attempt by states to get what they consider really the ultimate objective, which is to have situations in which they don't have to accept asylum applications. Unfortunately, what Poland has done is in this direction and is unlawful according to current EU law, and would be unlawful even when the Pact is in force. It's in force when it's fully applied. So, and a number of other member states have already put into their own law similar measures allowing them supposedly to avoid accepting asylum applications in similar circumstances. We would argue those are also unlawful. And I think this should be understood also in the context, which no doubt you're more aware of even than we are, of the current debate in Germany on invoking Article 72. And the real coming crisis is when the German government changes, and assuming that Merz comes in as Chancellor and does what he is saying he will do, of invoking Article 72 and suspending acceptance of asylum applications in Germany. All should be prepared for this. As a final note on this, I think the Pact in itself will neither save nor destroy asylum in Europe. It's the actions of the states that will do that. And in that context of states searching for justification or legalizing ways to not accept asylum applications, they need to be aware of what will happen if the common system collapses. And certainly for a country like Germany, they're not going to have fewer asylum applications if there's no common European asylum system. So I think there are many sort of alarmist and worrying things happening, but that debate and the search for exemptions and excuses and derogations, I think, is the one that needs to be addressed and will provide the next major crisis on this issue.
Keep the microphone, because I'm asking you also to come in on the question on cooperation with third countries.
Yes.
And of course, ECRE has also worked on this issue. Before we move on to the Italian, so to say, deal with Albania, thinking more broadly about partnership, and I believe you have also an event coming up where you will be discussing Mauritania.
Yep.
Is there any silver lining that you see in partnerships? Is there something that you can say that makes you optimistic, or is it just about containment in your view?
No, so I think the whole debate of attempts to transfer responsibility to other countries, it doesn't work because those other countries are actors themselves. And this can often be, I think, a very neo-colonial discussion that with the right amount of threats and bribes, we will convince those other countries to take on Europe's responsibilities. Of course, they're not willing to do that. And in many cases, these are countries that are already hosting large numbers of people either forcibly displaced or in other situations of migration. So that debate goes back. I think the first serious discussion at Council was in 2003. And again, things are proposed. We see with the Italy-Albania deal again and again, it's not going to work. Resources go into those efforts. They're somehow a sine qua non of the discussion among states, but they're not going to change very much. And for other states, I think the risk is that you have the easiest countries to do a deal with are the most repressive, and then you have a negative impact on the situation of people in that country, local population and migrants. So they can have a very negative impact. It's not to trivialize them, but they never really work in the way that Rwanda hasn't worked. And to go to the specific question of the use of safe third countries and other legal concepts, there we will rely very much on the CJU for setting the parameters for the use of that concept. And the 4th of October judgment in the Greek case, I think, is very interesting. And there, in particular, what we would underline about that judgment is in a case where the other country is not readmitting, which happens very often, there has to be access to a regular procedure. So in all of these, when deadlines are missed, when the border procedure doesn't take place within the timeline, getting people into the regular procedure, when the safe third country concept is not working and you can't send people there, getting people into the regular procedure is, I think, a key to making this work and ensuring that there's still access to asylum in Europe.
Thanks, Catherine. And Philip, I'm going to turn to you and ask you about another side of the discussion on safe third countries. As I believe we all see the paradox of a provision in the legislation that paves the way for a re-evaluation of the definition of what a safe third country is before the rules are even to be implemented in full. And I want to ask you about this because we more and more hear about the lack of vision, but also how counterproductive it can be to introduce legislation, to introduce change without an adequate assessment. And of course, when it comes to migration policy, you've seen this in past years. There is oftentimes almost a reflex to bypass considerations around impact assessments and instead to use urgency as a reason for introduce further change. And I ask you this in relation to safe third country, but of course there are other reforms that we haven't really discussed, including in relations to return, a possible reform of the return directive, where this question will come up again. And I believe this question was also raised during the hearing to the designated commissioner. So if you can elaborate on this, and other than this, there were many questions. So if you also want to exercise your freedoms in accordance, and so feel free to also pick up other important elements that you see in the questions that were raised. Yes.
Thank you. Well, just a complimentary word to what Liliana said regarding the definition of what is a safe third country or a safe country of origin. Actually, we have for the moment in the legislation very good definitions, extremely demanding, to the point that actually it's difficult, if you apply those criteria rigorously, to find many safe countries in the world. You have almost only a very limited number if you take the criteria seriously. Well, there is, of course, the paradox that it would have been possible to change the definition of safe third countries during the discussion on the pact, but that it was not done, and that it is now in the program. Well, actually, this is a kind of problem of member states always willing to go further into a restrictive policy. We just have the pact, and then that's not enough, and then we need more, and so on. Where actually are we going if we follow that road? So that's, I think, what can be said about the definition of safety of countries. I don't know if you want me to add another thing in your question. There was
on questions, a question on impact assessments.
Yes.
This is becoming more and more relevant, I think, in the broader discussion on migration policy.
Well, actually, you put the finger about when you quote the new proposal for a return directive that will be adopted by the Commission very soon. It is said before the summer, and we can deduce from this that there will be no impact assessment or no real impact assessment. And it's not the first time that the Commission tries to place with this issue of saying, well, we have not done a real impact assessment, but nevertheless we had enough elements that can be used as an impact assessment. I'm afraid that the same will happen with the return directive. And honestly, I'm also wondering why it is that urgent to have a Commission proposal before the summer. Because I doubt that the legislature, and in particular the Council working groups, are going to cancel their holidays in July and August to discuss this proposal. So actually this proposal would come then in September. I think that it would not change the face of the world, but it's once again quicker and quicker and quicker without applying the procedures regarding the adoption of legislation and the better regulations rules that should apply to the Commission.
Thanks, Philippe. And now, not to put you on the spot, but of course, feel free, Desi, to comment on any of these relevant points that have been mentioned.
It's always good to see that all eyes are looking to us for answers. I'll try to provide as many as I can. To be very honest with you, this is the biggest challenge that we have currently. We are trying to focus on implementation, on the implementation of the Pact. And the Pact is there. It's very well defined what is in the Pact and what is outside of the Pact. Every time I engage in a discussion, I end up answering questions that are outside of the Pact, that are something else but not the Pact. I really, really see the need that we all collectively focus on the Pact. First, there are many good things in the Pact. There are answers of half of the questions. There is something in the Pact. It's just not always the answer is black and white. There is a lot, this is possible, but under these conditions. This is possible under other set of conditions. It's not either relocation or nothing. There is something in the middle between these. We have a lot of experience, lessons learned since 2014 onwards. Just to give you an example, the second generation of the Common Implementation Asylum legislation, the one that we are amending currently, the one that was adopted in 2013, most of it was directives. And just a kind of a reminder that the deadline of transposing these directives, it was the summer of 2015. So you remember, most of you remember the summer of 2015 and what exactly we were facing. So this is just another lesson. What we try to deliver with the new Pact is a future-proof and more resilient legislation, something that caters not only for the current situation, but also to have for the future all these comprehensive approaches, all these strategic approaches, the integrated policy making, it is all there. I'm going directly for some of the questions. 7 days for screening, 12 weeks of, for the border procedure. It is possible. It is possible, and actually we need these deadlines, because one of the lessons from the past, there were a lot of systems with backlogs, applications that cannot be dealt with. For the screening, this is a very clear process. It's not even a procedure, it's a process. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Member states need to do it for 7 days, because this is the time actually where the applicant is, it's not only for applicants, but from the perspective of the applicant, your application is on hold while this, so you cannot be 1 month for screening. Then 12 weeks for the border procedure, but you need to put it in the context that border procedure is for certain categories of people. It's not for all applicants. It's for certain categories of applicants. You match this criteria, then you go to border procedure. It's not applicable for all the procedures. Then instrumentalization, it is part of the crisis regulation. We have a clear definition, what is instrumentalization and what are the measures that can be done in the future in this regard. This is, this is everything that we need to take a look in the current situation when we talk about the implementation of the Pact. The cooperation with the third countries is again something that we need to factor in the comprehensive approach, because we cannot just focus on the internal aspect the way we cannot just focus on the external aspect. They both are represented, should be represented together in the Pact implementation. It's not one is replacing the other. They go hand in hand. And my final remark is on the relocation. As I said, relocation is part of the solidarity measures. Member states are free to decide whether to relocate or not, but once they pledge relocation, it becomes mandatory, and unlike in the past, we have very concrete procedural rules how it should work in the practice. And we have a little bit of mirroring to the relocation transfers, to the Dublin transfers, to the shift of responsibility in case of relocation, the way it works for the Dublin transfers. The Pact is quite detailed. It's more than 300 pages of concrete measures to be implemented. There can be a lot of questions on the implementation, and take it as a request from my side. Let's focus on the implementation of the Pact, that it's on the table and not go everywhere, because otherwise we will have neither this nor this. Thank you.
Tell it to the member states. We, despite being sceptical, are persuaded. Our focus is on implementation of the Pact. But if we hear again and again states coming with n'importe quoi, then they need that message, not us.
We are telling it everyone, the member states, on first hand, because through all these implementation plans we organize and all the process, it is the process, as you have seen in the Commission communication on the common implementation plan, it is the implementation plan for the Pact. It's not the implementation plan for everything, it's for the Pact. These are 10 building blocks concretely focused on the legal aspects of the Pact. Thank you.
Thanks to both, and I was hesitating a bit at jumping in, but what is clear, I think, from the conversation today and from the latest exchange is that evidently the Pact was never meant to be the end of a process, but the beginning of a process with clear deadlines, with processes in place, with a new cycle, and we will continue looking at all of these aspects, EPC, Odysseus, FES, I'm sure ECRE will continue its good work in the future in line with what Catherine has just mentioned. So please keep an eye out on our upcoming activities. I would kindly ask our audience to now join me in a round of applause to our speakers for the excellent inputs. and also invite you all to join the reception. And I am not going to be a good host because I have no idea where this is taking place, but I suppose not in this room, but probably just around the corner. So stay and continue discussing with us, and have a good afternoon, everyone.